Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, a show where we meet the people designing the future of creative work and shaping our culture. I'm Bill, and this is Carl, and we are your hosts. Hey, Carl.
Hey, Bill. Let me ask you a question. Where did you go on vacation as a kid?
Well, I went primarily to either Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where my grandmother lived, or I would go up to the mountains in New Hampshire to this resort that was like a quintessential summer kind of mountainy place. Mm-hmm. You know, it was like lodge feeling, and it had they would have karaoke and traveling comedians and musicians and magicians and stuff at night.
Oh my God.
For the kids, yeah, and that was like my annual trip. You know,
wow.
we would do that every summer.
Okay, and what do you remember most about either of those places?
Well, this probably isn't the answer you're trying to lead me to, but what I remember most about the New Hampshire place is two things. One, they had a bear show, so like you go and this bear tamer guy would get this giant bear to do all these tricks. But even more than that, there was a show they would do for kids where you would go and take this train around the mountain, okay? Mm-hmm. And while you're taking the train around the mountain, there is a man dressed as a werewolf driving a go-kart alongside the train, threatening you. So he would have like what I assume is a fake shotgun, and he would appear.
You assume it was New Hampshire. It could have been a real one.
It could have been, but he was very menacing, and he was called the Wolfman. And he would show his gun at you and scream from his go-kart, and then he would disappear. I mean, it'd be shocking and terrifying for young children. I don't know why they did this. And then, like 3 minutes later, he'd reappear alongside the train in his go-kart with his gun. You know, I can't remember what the point of it was. I can't remember what the punchline of the whole experience was, but I do remember it being pretty terrifying. So anyway, that's what I remember.
Was this Clark's Trading Post?
Yes, it was.
Yes, it was. Clark's Trading Post. Right.
Welcome home to Clark's. Even though we're in the midst of a pandemic, our attitudes have been nothing but positive.
I'm the Wolfman. And to all you city slickers out there, I was the original social distancinger.
At Clark's Bears, the entire team has been working to prepare for your visit in 2020. You'll notice that we've implemented a...
This is imperative for the listeners to know about this thing.
Well, today's guest is photographer Tyler Haughey, and
who for a long time was the Wolfman in New Hampshire before taking on a second career as a photographer.
I mean, I don't think anyone's ever seen him and the Wolfman in the same place at the same time.
That's very true.
So Tyler is a photographer, and his focus, his vision is the idea of the vacation destination. He began his career photographing up and down to the Jersey Shore. He's from the Jersey Shore outside Asbury Park. And his early work really focused on the off season of the shore and going into these towns and beach, resorts and seeing what they look like when they're empty. At a certain point, he started gravitating toward this specific city called Wildwood. Wildwood is hard to describe. We get into it in the episode, but the thing that is most notable is that it has a huge concentration of mid-century beach motels, which all have these outlandish, crazy neon signs dating back to the 50s and 60s. And what I think Tyler is exploring is kind of the gap between the experiences we have on vacation, our memories of those experiences and those places, and the reality of them, and how our memories implants a certain version of this place in our mind that is only this very brief snapshot of what the place is actually like. What do these towns, beach enclaves look like when the tourists are home and the motels are closed and the lights are off? And really ask ourselves, like, what are these places for in our lives? And what does it mean when they change? He and I are both from New Jersey, so I've been a fan of his work for a long time for that reason, because I think he captures a side of these places I'm familiar with in a way that really resonates.
You know what's funny about that story is this past weekend, I was with my friend up in Hampton Beach. But now that it's October, we were up there for the weekend, and it's pretty closed. And literally every time we would walk past a storefront, he had not been there in probably 15 years. He was remarking, that used to be this sign, or that used to be this store, or that used to be this. He remembered this vivid memory of what that place used to be.
Yeah.
Largely because of the signage. And if we could extrapolate, because of the typography used, right? Which identifies that signage.
Yeah. So as you go into this episode, I would encourage you to kind of think back to places you went to as a kid or as a teenager that really made an impression on you, and think about the images you hold in your mind that sort of anchor that place in your memory. And how would you feel if you went back and found that they were no longer there, or that, you know, some business had swapped out the old sign for a new sign that maybe wasn't as fun or didn't have as much character, and really think about, you know, what these memories and what these places mean to you.
It'll be interesting for everyone to listen to, you know, from a personal standpoint. So I would love to turn it back over to you, Carl, for an episode I think that our listeners will really enjoy. A conversation between Carl and the Wolfman. Thank you, everybody. No, just kidding. Carl and Tyler. Please enjoy, everybody.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carl, and I'm really excited to be here today with Tyler Haughey, a photographer and fellow native of the great state of New Jersey. Tyler, welcome to Creative Characters. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
I feel like we need to put a disclaimer on this conversation, which is that you and I are both from New Jersey. New Jersey features prominently in your subject matter, so there's going to be some New Jersey content today, but we're going to try not to be obnoxious about it.
You're right. We can't avoid it, but we'll try to not hit you over the head with it.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting about it is we're from very different parts of it. I'm from North Jersey outside New York City, but you're from what I think is a pretty interesting part of the state. So why don't you talk a little bit about where you grew up and sort of what it was like in that part of the Garden State?
Yeah, I grew up down the Jersey Shore in a town called Wanamassa, New Jersey, just outside of Asbury Park. And my little area of it is just like a couple blocks from the Asbury border. So we grew up very much in that shore culture, beach culture. You know, summertime was obviously a huge thing, and the tourist season, the 10, 12 weeks of the summertime, and then the off season. And so much changes around there. And you'd go hang out in these towns that are right along the beach, and it would feel so entirely different than in season.
Well, Asbury's interesting because it's probably one of the few places that people outside of New Jersey have heard of, thanks to a particular prominent rock and roll legend. But it's also a place that's been through quite a journey over the past century, from being a booming resort town in the first half of the century to being kind of derelict really in the 80s and 90s. And
yeah,
you know, it's kind of on the upswing now in a way that maybe some people like and other people are question. What was it like when you were a kid, you know, and what's your experience been watching this city find its footing again?
Yeah, it's been really interesting and to watch it happen, because everything does seem to be changing so fast. Growing up when we were really young, it was a place you just like didn't go, you know, hard stop, the elementary school, middle school. So like the 90s, the boardwalk was desolate. There was no stores. Main Street was kind of decrepit too, you know, and Carl, like you were alluding to, it like stemmed from like the race riots in 1970 and lack of correct government decisions and further issues that just kind of compounded on one another. And then when I became old enough, you know, a teenager, that element of, some things like, you know, a little off here, a little exciting, not sure what you'd find if you go down there, that became really enticing for my friends and I. And we'd ride our bikes down there. We'd go exploring in some of the abandoned buildings. That's also kind of when I started getting into photography, and, you know, your classic high school photographer just taking pictures of ruined porn and all these buildings that are falling apart and graffiti and, you know, all the kind of cliches that come with that. But it was kind of this, like, you had it to yourself. And not only in the off season, like in the summertime, if you went down there up through the early 2000s, like there was nobody on the beach. There was definitely no like I was saying, boardwalk activity or restaurants or storefronts. But yeah, and then in the off season, it was like a teenage playground. It kind of had this Lord of the Flies vibe where there was just like you could go down there and just kind of get lost in the different buildings and the boardwalk. And so with like all that being said about, you know, the music festivals like we were talking about and that kind of mini resurgence of culture there, I think in the early to mid 2000s, like kind of after those concerts started happening and this kind of musical subculture was going on, you did start to see this renaissance build across the city year after year. And when I entered college and every summer I'd go home and I'd go down to Asbury Park and there'd be people on the beach, which was just like, you know, what a concept. Or there'd be bigger bands playing at the Stone Pony or Convention Hall, or, you know, new restaurants opening and bars opening. And it had this like it was really developing this kind of identity of its own. And it's really just taken off from there. I mean, every year you go back there and it's kind of more and more just a completely different city from the one that I grew up next to. And now there's like there's hotels being built there. It's like the first hotel in like over 50 years. And this kind of glass high rise that's right on the beach that has condos for over $1 million. And Carl, you and I were talking and you made a good point about how this kind of like identity that Asbury has taken on is almost like an appropriation of what Asbury Park has like become known as in the broader sense of the world.
Yeah, it's like someone's idea of what Asbury Park should have been or should be. It's kind of like if someone took a Springsteen song and was like, let's make it into a town. When you go there, it feels like Asbury Park is like someone's idea of Asbury Park based on what they heard about Asbury Park. And, you know, I can't tell if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's probably good for the community, but there is like a weird uncanny valley to it when you're there, where you're kind of like, this is cool, but it feels like slightly Disney-ish in the way it's executed.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely, it's by design and it feels a little forced, and it's based off of the kind of ideal things that Bruce wrote about in the mid 70s, which wasn't even, you know,
we could do a whole conversation on that.
Right. No. So it's I don't know, my mind's going like a mile a minute on this.
It's like a delicate balance between progress and kind of like preservation, but progress is probably, again, good for the community, but it's just kind of like, what are you building, I guess, is the question. Like, are you building, you know, a place that with authenticity, or are you building a place that is consumable, I suppose? Right.
And I think that is so very 2021, where these two companies were put in charge of the Asbury Park oceanfront 10, 15 years ago, and they have a whole team of marketing and PR, and they're like, how do we best frame this to the public nowadays? And that is very much about developing a brand and a feel, and is just kind of like icky and unnatural. But then it has its good side too, you know?
Yeah, so. I know. I love the public art initiative. I love the wooden walls and all the large scale murals and installations they do. That's legitimately cool. But yeah, it's a tough balance to hit right, where you satisfy the people that know it for what it was and satisfy the people that, you know, you need to sort of rejuvenate the economy. So it's tough, but good compromise leaves no one happy.
That's right.
You mentioned to me previously that your father was a union sign painter. So curious if you want to talk about how that influenced how you took in your surroundings, and if that sort of played into helping you focus in on a particular subject matter for your photography.
Yeah, I think it definitely plays into it, whether even, you know, on a subconscious level. But yeah, growing up, my dad worked for a company called Central Jersey Sign. This is another quick Jersey sidebar, but there's this argument on whether there even is a Central New Jersey or if it's just a North and South Jersey. But Central Jersey Sign,
I think there is,
confirms that there was in fact a Central. and still is a Central Jersey. So he was a union sign painter. He, would help in the fabrication of it at the warehouse, or go on these crazy jobs to install them and rig them. And whenever we would drive up by Newark Airport, he would always point to the big neon Anheuser-Busch sign that's on top of the building up there, and was like, I hung that. And so there was like a real...
Oh, he did?
He did, yeah. No, not by him. Yeah, he was part of a team.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, and it rotated.
It did, exactly. He did a lot of side jobs too, and I think a lot of them would be more local. I remember driving past the florist on Norwood Avenue, and he pointed out, like, I made that sign, or he made the sign for my nursery school. And it was a lot of these just kind of, colorful text, vinyl on wood or vinyl on, sheet metal. But yeah, so he had the union job, but then either would bring work home or have these side jobs that he would work on in the basement. And I distinctly remember going down in the basement, and he had this nice big easel and all these like cool tools that just felt so foreign to me as a little kid, but would help him peel back the vinyl backing and use the X-Acto knife. But I think it was always just this sanctuary that was just full of these colorful and bold and graphic designs and typography and a lot of logos. And he's a fantastic draftsman too. So he would draw a lot with colored pencil, and there were times where he would turn the drawings into these neon graphics and cartoons and kitschy things like that. But yeah, it made an imprint on me. And I think in the moment, I don't know how aware of this I was, but when it came to what am I drawn to when I'm out shooting and have my antennas out, like looking for subject matter, and to make pictures, like I'm drawn to these bold, colorful signage or just like roadside kind of vernacular structures and expressions.
Yeah. Well, I imagine it must have been interesting to move through the world with someone who does that for a living, whether they're pointing out work that they've done or just drawing your attention to signs, to letters on things, and just pointing out stuff that, a lot of people, even if they see it, they don't really think about what they're looking at. They don't really think of it as work, or as a craft. They just think of it as like, a direction or words on a window or something like that. So was he the type to always draw your attention to your environment in that way?
Absolutely. I can picture driving in the car with him, and this lasted until I was like out of the house in college. We'd be driving together, and all of a sudden he'd be like, oh, great sign. And he'd like point to a sign like on the road or, up on the hill. He's, that's a great sign. That's a great sign. And it's something where that acknowledgement is so key. And there's this photographer, his name's Joel Meyerowitz, and I heard him say once that taking a picture is like saying yes. It's confirming what's in front of you, being excited about it, and pointing with a camera and saying yes. So similar to what Tim Haughey would do.
As a kid, were there any signs in your neighborhood or in your town that were your favorites, or that, you have like an association with? For me, it was the Dairy Queen sign downtown, because I just knew it was ice cream, but it extended out over the road at an angle. And I always just thought that was cool. It was like at an angle, and then it had the logo glowing on top. And I just thought it was cool. But was anything stand out in your memory?
It definitely. And in preparing for this, I was texting with my brother, asking him too, because being a son of my father, we both have this affinity for these things I'm talking about. So I asked him, like, we were reminiscing for a moment. There was a place called Circus Drive-In in Wall, New Jersey, that actually just closed a couple years ago. But I heard recently that they saved the sign, which is good, because it was this amazing, definitely more creepy than anything else, massive neon clown face. And it was so big. It had to be like 2 or 3 stories tall. So yeah, my aunts live right around there, and we'd go swimming at their pool, and then we'd go to the circus for like dinner as kids, just classic like summer evening. Yeah, so that one stuck out for me. I think Asbury Park specifically has a sign or former logo known as Tilly. It's kind of become this icon for the city. It's on all the t-shirts and stuff like that. But when I was a kid, it was on this building, the Palace Amusements. The guy back in the early 1900s who built Steeplechase Pier in Coney Island actually built another pier of sorts in Asbury Park, and he brought the Steeplechase logo, which is this like creepy smiling face.
It is a little bit. It's creepy in a very kind of like 1920s idea of funny way.
Yes.
If that makes any sense.
It does. It reminds me too of these like buttoned up like English school kids from like a Pink Floyd video or something. I don't know. So he brought the logo and it just stood as this kind of beacon over Asbury Park through the 80s, the 90s, like the kind of desolate years I was talking about before. And then in 2004, they knocked down Palace Amusements, but there was this grassroots movement in town. They were called Save Tilly, and they had the original Tilly removed and put in storage. And I remember going down there, I was like 15, going down there with my neighbor, and I was more into like video than photography back then. And I remember like shooting the whole removal of Tilly.
Wow.
So yeah, so I feel like even back then I kind of knew for whatever reason these things mattered in a way. And if these places are going to change and there's this gradual loss of this like identity over time, and Tilly's of course just like kind of signifier of that, and that should be addressed and documented in some way.
Tilly's one of those things where when I see it, I have to ask myself, was there a point in history where this wasn't creepy?
Right.
You
Was
know?
this ever cute?
I know.
Or...
And it's like, if you ever see photos of old Easter Bunny costumes and you're like,
what were you thinking?
This is terrifying. It's objectively terrifying. So like, what were people's sensibilities like when this, because this is like, how was this ever not terrifying?
Scaring the kids was just as much of an interest as bringing them in and making them happy.
I guess so. All right, so let's talk about then how you evolved into a photographer. At what point did that settle in for you as something that was going to be maybe more than a hobby? What flipped the switch from this is something I enjoy to this is something I really want to build my life around in some way?
Yeah, I think it started with shooting videos and shooting photographs simultaneously. And when it came time to, choose a path for the rest of your life when you're 17 years old, which is kind of insane, those were like the two interests I had. And luckily I had a family that was willing to support that and get behind that instead of just being like, study business or whatever. Yep. So I kind of applied to schools. I remember I applied to one school for video and then Drexel University for photography. And I actually went to the Hofstra University for video for a little bit and then realized I made a grave mistake and transferred to Drexel for photography. Luckily, they gave me a second chance. But yeah, so and then once I got there, I feel like I kind of realized how much it can be looked at as an art form, not just learning how to take pictures in a studio, but learning the kind of history of the medium and the fine art photographers that I found myself drawn to, and that kind of opening up this whole world of like, wait, you can like photograph that and explore this in a conceptual way but bring like your own voice to it. So once I kind of came to these conclusions, I was off to the running. And honestly, from like some of the first photo classes I took at Drexel, I was like going home and like photographing at the beach in the off season. So I kind of knew my lane early on.
Yeah.
But in a way that was really helpful because it kind of allowed me 3-4 years to develop that voice and get some invaluable feedback on my work and improving it. And when I was there, I was working on a project where I was exploring the entire coastline of New Jersey. That I called it 130 miles, which is the top to bottom length of the Jersey Shore. And I had set some really strict parameters and rules for myself that every 23 miles, I would go to that spot on the coast and make a picture, whether it was something interesting or I would just find a way to make a picture out of it. And by doing that, I stumbled across this abandoned film set, I always kind of say, where there was all these places and everything was boarded up, but still had so much character, like even when it was shuttered. And at that moment, I kind of made a mental footnote of, okay, I've got to come back here and make some work sometime and explore it further.
Outside of the Northeast, I feel like there's a very cliched perspective of what New Jersey is, and particularly what the shore is. All cliches are true to a point, so there is an element of what people perceive is probably true. But I mean, the shore is, 130 miles long and has all these different communities up and down the length of it. And so it's not really any one thing. And when I look at your work, which we'll get into in a bit, I really feel like you capture that well. You capture this range of experiences that you can have on this long coastline.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I always think that the shore itself is kind of a microcosm for the state, right? There's towns that are just completely residential with these massive McMansions, and there's very little public access at the beach. But then a couple miles away, it's a state park or national park up at the gateway. Then there's the amusements. So it kind of offers a lot of different options for leisure and recreation, which is nice. And it's not something you get at all vacation destinations.
Growing up there, my family went down every summer, and a lot of families that I knew went down every summer, and you sort of have your spot. And for some people, it's LBI, Long Beach Island. Some people would go to Seaside or Asbury Park or Wildwood, more action and a lot more of a range of things to do and whatnot. And my family always went to Cape May, which is I kind of felt like in between. And I think I wouldn't say it struck me as a kid, but as an adult, now I kind of see like the Jersey Shore is very democratic in the sense that it can kind of be something for everyone. It kind of takes all comers. And for people who came to the country with nothing and grew up in that metropolitan lower and middle class community, like the shore was it. That was the destination, and it offered a form of escapism and a vacation that really was very special. And so, coming from that area, I think there's this multi-generational family tradition that's established with this location. It's very much a fabric of living there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I think you kind of build your summer around what town you go to, where you spend your summers. And it's the same with me. My grandparents grew up in Brooklyn. They, in post-war years moved to northern New Jersey, like Hunterdon County area. My grandfather was a professor at Rutgers, and in the late 60s, Long Beach Island was pretty much just like a spit of land off the coast. Very little residential or commercial life down there. They bought a house, and it's still in our family to this day. And it's a place I grew up going to, every summer for a week with family, and would bring a buddy down with me usually. And it was such a different feeling from the shore town I grew up in 40 miles north, and then an entirely different feeling from Wildwood, which is 40 miles south. So you kind of get a different experience and a different sense of place and feeling, and based on the hyper location that you're in.
Yeah. All right, so now that we've established the shore a little bit and maybe broken down some stereotypes about it, let's talk about the city of Wildwood specifically, mostly just to give people a sense of what it's like there who haven't been, because it does feature, not exclusively, but prominently in your work. And I feel like of the places I've been, it is unique. There are plenty of cities that have boardwalks and rides and stuff like that, but Wildwood is on a scale that is a little bit different. So why don't we kind of like set the scene a little bit so that when we get to talking about it in your work, there's some background. So when did you first go there, first of all?
My first experience with Wildwood was on a summer night when I was, I think, 21 years old. Mm-hmm. Not even, maybe 20. A bunch of friends and I got in a car and got a motel room down in Wildwood, and it was this place I had heard of my whole life, never been, because why would I go to a different beach town if I grew up, close enough to my own. I remember waking up the next morning, and obviously things were a little hazy and it just kind of like extra bright, and you got the sunglasses on. We were like walking around and driving around, and I'm like, what is this place? It feels like a time capsule. Like everything around there, whether it's all the motels or the stores and the restaurants, the boardwalk, like everything just had such like personality and this really like cohesive feeling to it of, again, this sense of place that there wasn't a version of in the part of the Jersey Shore where I was from.
Yeah. I mean, what makes Wildwood special and what I remember about it going as a kid is that it has a really high concentration of mid-century beach motels, right? And most of these hotels would have been family run, or at least family opened, family run when they opened, and possibly multiple generations of families operating them over decades.
Definitely.
And each one of them would have this kind of campy theme attached to it, right? You would have one that was like Southeast Asian, Singapore, Grecian, space, Caribbean, all this stuff. And they had these extraordinary neon signs to boot, right? And I just remember being a little kid driving up from Cape May, and you kind of come in through salt marshes and then some low residential buildings. You go toward the ocean, you hang a left, and it's just as far down the street as you can see. It's just Technicolor glowing neon signs in all these different crazy themes. And it was my favorite part of going was, I mean, maybe not when I was a kid, I liked the food and the rides, but it's the thing that stuck with me the most was just driving down the street and seeing all of these signs go by and just being like, where am I?
Yeah, it's very much a strip. I've never been to Las Vegas. I can imagine that the street you're describing is an East Coast, South Jersey version of the Vegas Strip. And it's just, even to this day, covered in neon and colors, and all the structures themselves were built in the modern style. So a lot of like poured concrete and glass and very efficient as far as like with not only space, but cost.
Some of the theming was very basic. The placemaking was taking a culture and reducing it to obvious signifiers.
Yes,
so,
correct.
An easily recognizable lettering style, palm trees, coconuts, like a hotel will be like, we'll be the Tiki Hotel and we'll appropriate all of this symbolism from these cultures, but not really address the culture itself.
And there's this great book that I made a note about that I wanted to bring up here because I think it's really topical. It's called The Transportation of Place. And it's by Andrea Robbins and Max Bescher. They're two photographers. They met at art school and married. They've, I think, been partners in shooting ever since too. But they pretty much go around the world and explore this idea of contradiction of location. So bringing up Las Vegas again, how like Las Vegas has a Manhattan and it has like an Eiffel Tower. So in order to kind of set themselves apart from one another, because I think from 1955 to 1970, there was over 300 of these motels built in this 5-mile radius that makes up the Wildwoods. Mm-hmm. So in order to set themselves apart from one another, it was through themes and signifiers. So the colors and the signage and who could have the brightest neon bulbs to attract the drivers. So it's interesting to run that alongside like where we are headed as a culture. And I think to root out, there's definitely like negative aspects to this cultural appropriation, like you were saying, like exploiting the tiki hut or, mm-hmm. Yeah, that needs to be done. And I think we're at a point as a society where we recognize that, but I'm going to sound like a cranky old man here, but it's like everything looks alike and everything is just cookie cutter in a way that's done to like maximize profit. And it's this gradual loss of like identity, I feel like, whether that's on like a specific town or structure or whatever, or if it's like an entire region.
Your work has a very distinct point of view. And I think you're telling a pretty compelling story through your work. And I think the signage, this vernacular typography we're talking about is a major component of that story. I'm trying not to be too on the nose about it, but I'm just wondering, from a storytelling perspective, what are you trying to show to the world that you feel might be missed?
Yeah, I think what drew me to it originally and what still plays a part in my like kind of exploration of these places is this like idea of the space between the fantasy that these places conjure up and the reality of these places. I think more ambiguously, it's kind of playing too into like the memory of these places. So that speaks to the fantasy aspect, but how even these like memories can go from very familiar and recent and tangible And then as you get further and further away from that summer vacation, they kind of turn strange and they kind of take on this like fantastical element to it. And you're not really sure, like, wait, did that happen? Or like, was it really that sunny? You know, like you kind of just, I think the nature of memory is this kind of like, it just becomes less and less specific over time. But so playing with the space, like in between that transition too, of when a place goes from really familiar to less specific, it's almost like the place as we want it to be versus the place as it actually is. And I think lately in my new work, a lot of it is like playing along with the production of that image. So like kind of playing into it, leaning into it, trying to show like the limitations of those, like how little is required to really keep all that fantasy intact, how far we're willing to go to like allow ourselves to that self-deception almost.
Yeah.
And it plays back into escapism, Carl, like you were saying too, where that's a big part of it. We're obsessed with like separating out leisure from life, or the rest of life, work, whatever you want to call it. So like how far we're kind of willing to go to do that.
I think what separates your work from just kind of like pictures of signs, what separates it from that and something that's more universal is this idea of vacation and like what vacation is in a person's life. And it's not a story that's unique to the Jersey Shore or any particular place, but it's this idea of you as a person or as a family, you show up in a place on a given day, you stay for your length of time, and then you leave. And that length of time is your experience of that place. And that's what it is to you. So whether it's the Jersey Shore or it's Paris or it's a lake in Minnesota, that's what it is to you. And outside of that week or that 10 days, you don't experience it. You're not there. And so I feel like in your mind, you show up, you experience, you leave, and then the place freezes, right? And it stays the same. And if you go back, you kind of go back with the expectation that it's going to be exactly like you left it. And Correct. What I feel like your work does is capture all of the signifiers of that place that you look for when you return. So whether it's the sign, whether it's the fake palm tree next to the pool or whatever it is, you look for those signals that nothing has changed and you get to have the exact same experience. But I think what your work shows is that that's just not realistic. These places exist outside of your experience, they change. And the things that you're documenting in your photography are things that feel permanent, but are not.
Yeah, I think we're really getting into it here. I've honestly been thinking a lot about this. The idea of what are other people's versions of the small details and memories that I remember from these locations, like as a kid, which is pretty much verbatim to what you said before. And I think in order to depict that, without talking to these people specifically, you rely on the classic imagery and the tropes that have kind of come to define these areas, right? And it's because these places they're constantly in flux, right? And whether that's like from in season to off season, or whether that's these mom and pop motels being destroyed for these condominiums, I've been interested in trying to find these ways to show, like, are these places like being built or destroyed? Like this kind of in between flux of, are they improving or are they deteriorating? Like, is this heading out of season or is this coming into the season? And I think that to kind of leverage those specific feelings like we were talking about, or the memories that we were talking about, and then also like the tropes and the myths, right, of like, this fantasy and everything's kind of this like idealistic, perfect, like vacation summer life. I think through those tropes, like you can explore what's really going on underneath the surface, kind of like peeling back the curtain, I guess, in a way.
Yeah. A good chunk of your photography is done in the off season. I think that's to me, that's what really drew me into your work, because I've always been fascinated I live by the ocean now in Massachusetts, and my favorite time to go was the winter, because it's the time that most people outside of the immediate coastline don't see. And I think that's really key to your sort of storytelling, if you want to use that word, or to the perspective you're trying to bring, because your photography is bringing people to these places to see these familiar signifiers, these signs and these, the buildings and all this stuff when they're not supposed to see them, where in their mind they don't. So it is creating that sort of friction or dissonance between their lived experience and the reality of the place.
For me, it's like this interest in this kind of like disintegration, like seasonal disintegration, right? So like things are kind of like declining, right? And it's like so at first it's like the aftermath of the summer. I grew up working at beach clubs around where I grew up. I was the assistant manager of the Deal Casino Beach Club. I wear it with pride. Come Labor Day weekend, it would close, and my college at Drexel, it started in like late September. So I always had like a week or two, and I would like go back and like try to like help out and like clean the place up. But it felt back to that phrase I used before of like an abandoned film set, like people just like up and they're like, all right, well, see you next year, like time to leave. They'll leave like their lockers full of towels and chairs. And so it's kind of this like decline, and I'm into like what remains, like what's left. And I think early on, it was much more like, what are these buildings looking like when they're empty? What's left behind? But now I'm also like in the actual remains and the detritus of like, okay, what do you find in these locations in December, in January, in February?
Yeah.
And you're just it's just everything is like always in flux. But yeah, the off season, I think it kind of shows like what it's really like in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It's kind of strips away the beach towels on the railing and all these other kind of artifice, and just becomes more familiar, at least familiar for somebody who kind of grew up there. I think I'll speak for a lot of people and say that's our favorite time when you're growing up down there. So it's this like displacement from like the idealism of summer. But then again, it's cyclical, so it kicks right back up a couple months later.
The reason I gravitate towards signage in this conversation in your work is because it's just such a unmistakable and unmissable signal of that change. And it doesn't matter what kind of sign it is. It's like, I remember going to a hot dog stand when I was a kid, and they had a sign from the 60s that had some goofy like dancing hot dog on it. And then they changed it in the 90s and just made it generic. And I was like, well, this sucks, And I think that experience is universal of this very, in your face signal that time is moving forward, things are changing, and the experiences you had, are going to change with it and just sort of be locked in the past.
Yeah. I think in my work, like to your point, like, and everything old is kind of like new again, right? So you'd almost see somebody try to like replicate one of these authentic Wildwood motels in Omaha, Nebraska or whatever, and make it become like an Instagram destination, and it looks as if it was built in 1955. But like, so it's this kind of like re-interest in older things, and that to me sways nostalgic, which I do my best to not wade too deeply into in my work. That's to me kind of like an icky word, but I think it's inevitable to some extent. But more to just like talk about, what does this say about like our larger culture, right? Like the built environment kind of represents a culture in a way that few other things do.
Yeah. So since you brought up nostalgia specifically, there's a quote that I read over the summer in this book, and I actually thought of your work when I read this. It's in a book called How the Word is Passed. It's by Clint Smith. It's an interesting book about how places where slavery happened sort of reckon with that history. So that's the context. But the quote is from a guide at Monticello named David. And I'm just going to read it. I don't know what I want you to do with it, but I feel like it fits what we're talking about.
Okay.
So he said, I've come to realize that there's a difference between history and nostalgia, and somewhere between the two is memory. I think that history is the story of the past using all available facts, and nostalgia is a fantasy about the past using no facts. And somewhere in between is memory, which is kind of this blend of history and a little bit of emotion. I mean, history is kind of about what you need to know, but nostalgia is what you want to hear. And I feel like that kind of, you're putting your hands up.
Yeah.
I feel like,
was he like eavesdropping on this conversation here when he wrote that?
I know, right?
Yeah, that's like exactly kind of what I was saying earlier, like the place as it is versus the place that we want it to be. And I seek to kind of like play with the viewer, whoever that may be. Like I want to like play with their expectations and their assumptions, even more so, of like what they expect this place to look like or what they think this place should look like. And kind of like what you said later, like if I'm taking a picture that has a sign in it, like I'm not just turning in like a direct photograph of a sign and being like, here's the sign. I'm hoping that like there's something deeper and something more strange going on, or something that's speaking to some sort of historical aspect or like legacy of this place. So something just a little deeper than that, not just this like nostalgia, like, oh, look at this beautiful picture of a sign with a lobster on it. Yeah.
Well, as the vacationer, I feel like you assume the place will always be there, but people sort of take for granted that it will survive the winter and that the owners will come back and that they'll replace the light bulbs and they'll put the palm trees back where they belong and clean up. And there's this unseen process of bringing these places back to life after hibernating all winter that happens out of sight, that unseen life that exists outside the week or two that you get to enjoy them every summer.
Yeah, it's in the spirit of hinting and leaving clues that there's other things going on here instead of just your weekend down the shore.
All right, so let's wrap up by just talking a bit about what you're working on now. You shared some new photography with me, which was really great. And I know you have a show coming up, a new gallery show in New York, is it?
I do, yeah. It's at the Sears Payton Gallery in New York, in Chelsea, and it opens up on October 14th. It's going to run through November 20th. So if you're in Manhattan or looking for a little trip, go check it out. They're open, I believe, like Tuesday to Saturday, Monday to Friday. I don't know. Give them a call before you go.
Okay.
But yeah, so working towards that and kind of just dialing in the selection of what we're going to show, at what size. So it's been fun. It's been a lot of work, but it's been great. And yeah, so some new work. I think consciously been trying to like steer away from like this really like specific project oriented, like with the motel work we were talking about. It's this project that I did called Ebb Tide. And it was just very specific of like, there's this place, there's these motels, go take pictures of it in the off season, just like very cut and dry and just trying to be more open and kind of ambiguous in a way to open it up to kind of a wider array of locations around the Northeast and kind of put together a project or a series just like through an edit of the work as opposed to like a really like clean cut thesis. But yeah, and the work involves a lot of what we talked about already, the collective memory of these places, how it's familiar, but it's strange. It's kind of what I'm trying to go for and depicting and playing along with the appearances of these places and the production of that image and trying to kind of marry those ideas together in an interesting way.
It feels very you, but it is kind of nice to see a broader range, like see you exploring new spaces. I think I noted we were emailing back and forth that there's a lot more nature in these. And I like the way you capture the juxtaposition of like random bushes where they don't belong. And now it kind of feels like you're turning your camera not at what people see most when they're there, but what they probably don't see as much or aren't paying as much attention to. And showing maybe a different side of some of these locations. And I think there was some in Maine and looked like some New England destinations. I don't know if you were up this way.
Yeah, you got it. Yeah. Took a couple day trips up there.
Representing New England. Nice.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. And you're spot on. I think, that facet of the work has kind of caught me off guard, but I think that's sometimes the funnest part of seeing.
That's fun. Right?
Yeah, seeing what's there and what you've kind of been looking at or thinking about without even knowing it. So yeah, we'll see what comes of that.
Cool. Tyler, thank you for joining us. And for everyone listening, we'll put information about Tyler's show and hopefully some imagery from your portfolio on our blog. But I will also link off to your page so people can explore it in more detail. It's been great to talk to you. Again, I've been a fan for a while, so it was great to meet you. And yeah, keep up the good work.
Thanks, Carl. I appreciate it, man. This is fun.
Thanks for listening. If you want to learn more about Tyler and the work he's doing, look for a link to our blog post in the show notes of this episode. You can also visit monotype.com/podcast to read about all of our prior guests. And if you're local to New York City, check out his show at the Sears Payton Gallery, which is running from October 14th to November 20th. We've also placed a link for more details in the show notes as well. If you've been enjoying our podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify to rate and review this episode. And if you really like us, subscribe to the show and share us with your friends. Creative Characters is a production of Monotype, Christopher Sound, and Marie Tabarez. We'll be back with more episodes soon. Take care, everybody.
So Tyler, real quick, my Asbury Park story.
Oh yeah, what do you got?
1998, Vans Warped Tour. I'm like 17 years old. I don't know how I'm there. Again, my parents real tight sometimes, and then I feel like they would just like have like these mental breaks where they'd be like, yeah, that sounds safe. So I'm down there with a couple of my friends. We're roasting all day at the show, getting, our heads bashed in, seeing these ridiculous bands.
And everything was outside then, right? Like nothing was in Convention Hall.
Outside. And at the time, most of the blocks adjacent to the boardwalk, as you know, were flat. There was nothing there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they literally just like put up a fence and you'd be walking around and you were walking like over curbs and across streets that were like blocked off. So it was really wild. So yeah, we do the thing. And we bailed around 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening and went out to the boardwalk. I think we found something to eat and we're like, let's just walk out in the jetty, whatever. And we saw a guy who looked like he was fishing.
Yeah.
So we get out there and no shit, this guy had a ferret on a string and he was taking the ferret, throwing it in the water. It would swim around, it would catch a fish, and he would reel it back in.
Way.
and this memory is now so distant in my life that I find myself like not believing it. And I've checked with my friends, like that really happened, right? Like we saw the guy with the ferret. And they're like, oh yeah, that really happened. And the ferret's name was Budweiser.
No fucking
Because
way.
he said when he like got the ferret, and this guy was like, he had lived a life. He was probably in his like late 50s, tank top, the whole thing. And he was drinking beer. He said that he got the ferret, it got into some beer and he thought it was going to die and it didn't. So he named it Budweiser and blah, blah, blah.
I have so many questions. Was he on a hook, like a fishing hook?
He had almost like probably not clothesline or whatever.
Oh,
and it was like tied around the ferret, kind of like under its front arms.
So this guy was probably fishing to like eat, not for recreation.
Yeah, that was what I figured.
Wow, man. I thought that was heading towards. We walked out on the jetty, and this guy looked like he was fishing, but no, it was Bruce Springsteen.
No, although I have met him. But like you were saying, like beach was empty. There was nobody out there.
Yeah.
Boardwalk was empty. I mean, a handful of people scattered around. And then this one guy and and he had fish. So this had worked.
The best part about it is it worked.
It had worked. I feel like that sums up Asbury Park in the 90s.
Yeah, it does. There's the random. Oh my God. There was this like empty like swimming pool at an old motel that we used to go skateboard. And this guy like would throw bottles at us like out of his like apartment window, and then he came down and like chased us with a knife. Like it just constant chaos at that time.
Yep.